tender, hot and spicy, with a steamy look. It was passed on down by my mother, sweet. She told me, honey, this will be a real good treat, to turn a man's heart into a buttercream. Well, you cook a dish that makes him want jump and scream. So come into my kitchen,
Come into my kitchen.
come on down to my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
I said, come into my kitchen.
Come into my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Won't you come into my kitchen and I will feed you fine.
Welcome back. This is Down East Far East Kitchen, and I'm Jeff Mao, and I'm with
Chris Toy, and today we are going to continue getting ready for the Lunar New Year, and we're going to make steamed Char Siu Bao today.
and some red bean paste buns, and we'll show you even a couple other little variations.
Cool.
Well, I think we're going to start off with the pork because it takes a little bit of time in the oven, and go from there.
Yeah, great.
All right.
All right, thanks. So Char Siu means, in Chinese, it means fork roasted. And so originally, Char Siu pork or Char Siu beef or whatever other lamb, whatever other meat you had, was cooked over an open fire. And so anything that's roasted over fire, or in modern times in a kitchen or on a grill, is in fact Char Siu. But for Char Siu Bao, and Bao means bread or bun, what we're going to do is make a filling of roast pork. And what we're going to use is pork belly. We want a good amount of fat. And some stores, you might not be able to find pork belly, but you can use pork shoulder, which also has an okay amount of fat, not quite as much as pork belly. But what we'll do is we're going to marinate it, and you want to marinate it for at least a couple hours. So I've done this in advance, and I'll just kind of walk you through what's in here. So there's not really a standard marinade for Char Siu, but what you do want is you want a combination of flavors. Savory is one of them, sweet is another, and you're also going to want something called 5 spice powder, which is a mixture of pungent umami and some bitter flavors. So what we're going to use today is some hoisin sauce, and hoisin sauce, interestingly enough, is also known as Chinese barbecue sauce. So you can get that right in most grocery stores in the international section. Oyster sauce, which is a great source of what we call umami because it is a fermented seafood type sauce. If you can't eat shellfish, or someone that you're making them for can't do that, there is a vegetarian oyster sauce, and there's also a mushroom flavored oyster sauce. Mushroom being a very high source of that flavor, umami. You want some sweetness, and we've got some honey. Here in Maine, if we want some sweetness, what we will use is some maple syrup. So that's a nice option. You can also use brown sugar and some wine, and we use a Chinese cooking wine called Shaoxing wine. If you don't have cooking wine, you can certainly use something like sweet vermouth. Some people say you can use gin. You might want to add a little bit of extra sugar. This is a sweet wine, or a little bit of extra honey. And of course, our 5 Seasons powder. So, just here's what I do. This is about a half a pound of pork belly. So I put in a 1/4 cup of the oyster sauce, a 1/4 cup of the hoisin sauce, and a 1/4 cup of the honey. So that's easy. 1/4. A tablespoon of some cooking wine, just a teaspoon. This is pretty strong stuff. The 5-spice seasoning, just a teaspoon of that, and just put that into a container or a bag. I like to use a Ziploc bags because what I can do is I can get that marinating process going. And I tend to marinate at room temperature. What I find is if you try to marinate in the refrigerator, it actually stops the marinating process, because when you make fat cold, it solidifies and it actually makes it harder for the flavor to get into the meat. So this has been marinating for about an hour, and that's pretty good. If you do, some recipes will say marinate it overnight in the refrigerator, and so that's exactly what's happening. Is you're probably marinating for the equivalent of an hour at room temperature. You're just doing it in the refrigerator. So what we're going to do is we're going to roast our marinated pork, and we've got our oven at 450 preheated on bake. And so what we're going to do is we've got a setup in here, and see now it worked. You want a really moist oven. So what we've got is we've got a roasting pan which has about 1 inch of water at the bottom, and you can kind of, maybe you can see there's steam that's coming up out of there, which is exactly what you want. And I've got a rack right above that steam. We're at 450. And we're going to take our marinated pork and we're going to put that right onto our rack. So that we'll get that, spread it out. We want the heat to get to it, but we also want that moisture to get to it. And I don't know if you can see or not, but I've sliced the pork belly so that it fits onto that rack. But not so small that it falls through. And I'm going to save this. So we're going to roast this for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over and baste it and cook it for another 20 minutes, and then we should be done. And just at the end we'll raise the temperature a little bit just to get a little browning. So what we've done, this is not time lapse, we did this in advance, and here's what the pork will look like. I think this is a shoulder, so it's not going to have quite as much fat. What we want to do is we want to cut this up into small cubes in preparation for the filling. So we'll cut that into probably 1/4 inch slices. This is where it's nice to have a nice sharp knife.
So Chris, one thing I know that when you find this char siu in an Asian market, if you go to a Chinatown, if you're in a large city that has one, you often see this hanging in the windows sometimes of some of the various shops.
And it's red.
And it's deep red. And this, of course, you can see this char siu that we prepared in advance is not deep red. And I think the one that we've got in the oven is not going to come out deep red. So where does the red usually come from?
So there's two ways. The traditional red color actually comes from a fermented, I think it's a fermented tofu.
Okay, like red fermented.
Yeah. However, in modern times, there's also red food coloring that is used. Some folks will use the bottled food coloring. What other people will do is they'll cook up some beets and get the beet juice, and they'll mix that in. And one of the benefits of the beet juice is that it's sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, that will add a little bit of sweetness to it. So we've cut that up so it's more than bite size. It's about a 1/4 inch. And what we'll do is we're going to make a little bit of we're going to glaze it a little bit. We're going to cheat a little bit in that we'll add some of our marinade that we had set aside for the glaze. Just heat this up. There we go. So I use a wok, but you can certainly use whatever pan you have. And so here's the glaze that we had marinating, and I'm just going to put a couple tablespoons. We don't want this swimming in it, because when we heat this up, it's going to, the fat is going to come out of this as well. So we're not going to cook this so much as what we're going to do is make sure that that glaze covers all of our pork. And once we've done that, we'll turn it off and we'll let it cool off, because we don't want to use a hot filling in our char siu bao. So you can kind of hear that sizzling. And as soon as you've got that, you could turn that right off. All right. So this is ready when it cools off to use for filling. So it is time to turn our pork. So we're still at 450, and I've got to remember to keep my face out of the oven so my glasses don't steam up. But what you'll see is that it's about 15 minutes, and you can see the pork has really browned up nicely. So we're going to turn this over. So that underside hasn't browned because the steam has been coming up underneath it. And you definitely want to make sure that you have this container, this pan underneath, because there's lots of drippings. There we go. And so now we'll baste this. And I noticed that I've got one very small piece here. It's almost like a chunk of bacon here. Oh, it's gone. We'll leave it alone. There we go. All right, so we flipped it, we basted it, and so for the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to turn this up to 500. And so that's going to really crisp that outside, but it's been basted. And there we go. So we've got our char siu bao well on its way. And here's our filling, which is the pork belly filling in our steam oven. And remember, we had turned the temperature up to 500 degrees to really brown those up. So what we'll do is we'll take this out. Just trying to not make a mess here. We'll take our roasted pork belly out now. You can see it's nicely browned. Take that over to our cutting board.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Come down to my kitchen.
I said, come into my kitchen.
Come into my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Come down to my kitchen.
Won't you come into my kitchen?
All right, so we're making some bao dough for our Char Siu Bao, and I've already got in here our flour and a little bit of baking powder. The yeast, for this particular version of this recipe, the yeast has been in some warm water with some sugar, and you can see that it's quite frothy. And the reason I do this way is because I want to give the yeast a little bit of a head start. So this, obviously, whatever yeast was in there, there's more of them now because they've gotten going and they've been feasting on all that sugar. But this recipe is built so that once we get this dough mixed in the mixer, we'll let this mixer run for about 7-8 minutes until it's a nice smooth dough. Then I'm going to throw in about a couple teaspoons of butter at that stage. It'll work the butter in, but we don't want the butter immediately because it'll coat the flour and then that kind of messes up your gluten. But we do want the fat in there because that helps us soften the dough later. So we'll add that in, and then we'll knead it for a couple more minutes in the machine, and then the dough will be done. And at that stage, we're pretty much then ready to use it to start to wrap your bao. A lot of other recipes that don't kind of get the yeast going like this will then have a step where you need to rest the dough, let it double, punch it down, that whole kind of thing that you do with breads. This kind of helps you skip that step. We're still going to need to rest the finished shaped bao for about 45 minutes to let them rise before we steam them, but at least it removes that other step out. And so for me, it's a little bit easier in the kitchen if I'm making these to be able to go right from dough into shaping the bao, put them in the steamers, let them rest, and then for that 45 minutes I can worry about cooking other things or doing other things I need to clean up the kitchen, whatever. And go from there. So let me go ahead and just mix this in. So I'm going to just pour this all into our flour mixture and get this machine running. All right, and we'll get this thing going, and we won't have to watch it go because it'll just do itself for about 7-8 minutes. All right, so this has been going for a good 8, 9 minutes, 10 minutes by now, and a couple minutes ago I threw in about 2.5 teaspoons of butter, and that butter is worked in, and so turn that off so we can hear each other again, and we can take a look at this dough. So this dough is ready to go pretty much. We'll do just a little bit of work with it here. There it is. And what's interesting about this dough, and the reason I add the butter later, is typically when you add a fat to a dough, if you put it in at the front end, it will coat some of the flour, and then that flour doesn't necessarily mix up quite the same way. And in fact, some people will put it in early because it does lower the gluten, because some of that flour won't form into gluten. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and take this dough and just roll it out a little bit into a bit of a rectangle, just to kind of help me kind of pre-shape this for what I'm going to do to make my bao, to get these portioned out. Just fold this over once. There we go. And once I get this thing rolled out into a nice rectangle, the reason I do this is because I'm going to now roll this into a jelly roll, essentially. Try and get this to be pretty even in thickness. And as I cut this, then these end up being my bao, and this gets squished down on it, but if I kind of reform this into a nice circle, so I get little circles here. Each of these circles, then what I can do is, to start, I can just mash it down with my hand. Got a basic circle. Remember, dough has memory, so if we start with a circle, we'll end with a circle. We're going to roll these very similar to what we would do with a basic dumpling, which is I'm going to do that same little thing where I kind of roll around just the edge to thin the edges out a little bit and keep the middle thick. And I'm going to do this for all of these pieces of dough. This dough is kind of wet enough, so to speak, because it's got all that butter in it. And I'm moving fast enough here, I don't actually have to cover this, although some people will cover it if they're moving a little bit slower. But I think I can get through this dough, get all these things portioned out, and then I'm going to go ahead and fill them. Okay, so you see I've rolled out a number of rounds here and ready to make some bao. A couple different ways to fold these up or shape them. Let me start with this mix is a little bit cooler. This other one is still pretty warm. You want maybe a heaping spoonful here. You don't want to. The trick here is that people sometimes when they first get going they overstuff the bao, and once it gets overstuffed, if the glaze gets on the edges of the dough, it makes it harder to make it stick. And so just as a starting place, you may want to try and have a little less filling than you think you should, just to kind of make sure you can get it sealed up. And then as you get better and better at folding these things, you can start to put a little bit more and more in. One thing you can do is with my fingers underneath, there's some little space here. And sometimes what I'll do with the spoon is literally push down and stretch the dough that's beneath the filling, right? And that's why it's important when we roll these things out, you have thinner edges, thicker middle, because it gives you some dough to go in there. So one way to wrap these is with kind of the purse style crimping all the way around. So I just pick any place here and I just start to crimp right on top of so my thumb just stays here, and I'm just going to keep going all the way around and around and around and around until you can see I'm almost at the end here. I can take this thumb and kind of push that filling in there, and then kind of pull in and then pull, and then even the last one. There we go. So that actually seals it up. But these basic pleats will live on, and these are just some square pieces of parchment paper. You put these on the parchment mostly because if you place these right on your steamer, they'll stick. And so the paper is there just to keep them from sticking. So that's one way we can fold these. Let me do that one again, just so you can see that again. And these are pretty big pieces of dough, so I can get a fair amount of filling in these. Again, kind of push that down just to stretch it out in the dough. And then just start crimping and working my way all the way around, and really just try and stay up near the edges because it'll pull the rest of the dough with it. There we go. So that's one style. Another style, a lot of people like to have, and this will blow up, but it probably won't break. A lot of people like their Char Siu Bao to have that kind of broken top look to it, so we can kind of goose this into doing that. And if you've may have seen in some dumpling videos of a style of dumpling where I'm going to go about, we're going to think of this as thirds, 3 spots. Take 2 of these spots and kind of bring them together and just kind of seal this up. Make that stick, hopefully. Why isn't that sticking? Here we go. And then directly across here. And so I end up with 3 kind of pieces like this. Kind of a triangle. And then I take those, push down a little bit in the middle, and kind of curl this up, bring these to a point, and then seal again, but don't seal too tight. And that's kind of what lets this thing burst at those seam points. If you really seal this up, it won't burst. We'll see if this one bursts. That's another way of doing it, slightly different style. So let's try one more of that style again. Okay, I'm gonna use the pork belly on this one. Let's get a nice charring on this. So again, I'm gonna go about the 3rd point and then across to make a triangle. Seal these up, and and bring these up to a point. Kind of seal those edges together. And at some point in time, Chris, you and I were talking about this before, I can remember when I was young, Char Siu Bao often came with a smooth exterior. It didn't have that kind of burst, and often had like a little red stamp on it, I think to kind of let you know what was inside, because of course they all had the same look to them. And then let me take these rubbers. I've got here, I actually made this morning, but I'm going to recommend, for most people, this is more trouble than it's worth. This is red bean paste. They're made from azuki beans. And it's basically cooking from dried beans like you normally would cook from dried beans, so they get boiled in water for a long time, and once they're finally boiled and soft, then you can kind of mash them up, right? Drain out the water, mash them up, and then add some sugar, and you get, and put it into a food processor, grind it up. But it's a lot easier to go to an Asian market and simply find a can of pre-prepared red bean paste. So this is a sweet paste, so it's more of a dessert bun. And this one, at least the way I typically find them, these tend to get wrapped where the top is smooth. And so I usually just do this because it's quick for me to do these pleats, but I'm never going to see the pleats because then I'm going to flip it over and do it this way. And again, the primary reason I'm going to do this is so that when these are all steamed, I can tell the smooth one is the red bean paste, the ones that are not smooth are the pork in them. You could steam this the other way around, you could flip these over, you could do whatever you want, but sometimes you do kind of want to know what's inside them, particularly if you have, you know, some folks in your family who are vegetarians and others who are not, or you're just simply thinking this is dessert, it's sweet, and this is savory, and so I'm going to eat it at a different time. So I can mix up a bunch of these, make a couple more of these. These I'm going to go ahead and move them, transfer them into the steamer basket. And sometimes the other way to do this is just to draw these things together and kind of squish it all together, flip it over, and you still get a smooth shape to it. Put them in the steamer basket, cover it up, and then let them proof for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes to let the yeast kind of get going, and then we're going to steam them. So that's those basic shapes. Now another thing I wanted to do was also take a frying pan, so a big black frying pan here, and do the same basic thing but little ones, and we're going to pan fry these. So I'm going to kind of stretch out this dough a little bit, make much smaller dumplings. We'll see how these turn out. And same thing, I'm going to make some little rounds. Oftentimes these are made with a ground pork filling, a little bit more like you would find in your typical kind of pot sticker style dumpling. And we're going to actually cook these pot sticker style. So same thing here. Get around, those get a little sticky on me. Okay. So these are not going to fit a whole lot of ground pork in them, or Char Siu Bao pork. Anyway, but these I'm going to flip upside down anyway, so I'm just going to kind of seal them up. Put it right in the pan. We're going to let them proof in that pan. In fact, I can probably even just do this with my fingers. Get enough of a circle. Put a little bit in here, not a lot, because there's not a lot of space. These are a little bit more like a bite-sized snack. But it does get an interesting cooked flavor because we're going to end up with the crispy bottoms, steamed tops, but with a soft bread dough as opposed to the traditional dumpling dough. Okay, so we have our pan-fried, steam-fried bao, little bao. In here, we've already cooked them over a flame until the bottom started to brown, and we added some water and covered them with a lid so they could steam. So again, it's not so much water that they're getting boiled, just enough to create steam so the tops get steamed, the bottoms will be brown. Turned off the heat, but I can hear them sizzling away. So you can see they have puffed up. There they are. Quite well, and if we get in here underneath these, you can see, in fact, do you have a plate? All right, and so one of the ways that these can be served is, you just have to kind of be careful to do this. Flip that over and there we go. Look at that. So get the nice looking pattern from the pleats, and then you can see a nice crispy, now it is the top and the soft bottoms, and then you can just kind of like pull apart bread. You just pull one off and eat it. And so those are your steam fried bao. And then over here, we've got going our steamed bao, the bigger ones with the barbecue pork inside. And so these have been steaming for about 8-9 minutes now, after about a 45-minute proof. For the last half of that proof, just because it was a little bit chillier here in down East Maine, we actually turned on the heat for a little bit just to get the water up to not boiling, but it was warm so that it kind of created a bit of a more humid, warm environment, just to kind of get the yeast lively, kind of like putting your bread in a proofing box. Right? So in the summertime, you probably wouldn't have to do that, but here in the winter, it's a necessary step. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the heat here. Let's take a look at these things. There are those who will say never uncover these, wait 5 or 6 minutes because otherwise they'll collapse. We'll find out if that's true right now, but I have not had that happen to me. Knocking on bamboo here. There we go. Ah, look at that. Nice and puffy. So we can see these guys have done quite well, right? In fact, so puffy that they got bigger than the paper squares we put them on. So I don't know if we talked about that, but we talked. Typically, you're going to want to put a piece of wax paper or parchment paper or square underneath these, simply so that they don't stick to the steamer, right? And as a kid, I remember this was always kind of the thing that I enjoyed. It's kind of like getting cupcakes and you're peeling off the paper to make sure you peel off this paper before you eat it. Let's take a look and see what this looks on the inside. You can see filled with barbecue pork. Ooh, very good. All right, so that, I'll put that down before I burn my fingers. Ooh. There's our Char Siu Bao. And so we've got a couple steamer trays full of those, and our steam fried, pan fried, I think I'm gonna mash this up, and all of you who actually speak Chinese unlike me, shengjian-style, I think, or something like that. But you can see we can peel one off. Look inside. So again, this we filled with some pork filling, more like what you would put in a regular dumpling. So ground pork filling with cabbage. All right. Bon appetit.
I said, come into my kitchen. Come into my kitchen. Come on down to my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Won't you come into my kitchen?
Come into my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Come on down to my kitchen.
Won't you come into my kitchen? And now